Hello everyone, welcome back to our OpenID series. Today I'll be talking about the hybrid flow. Hybrid flow, it's a combination between the implicit flow, which is a weak protocol, I would say protocol, but a weak flow in the OpenID protocol. And you can see my previous video to understand why. But was popular when it was created. And the new one, which is authorization flow, that it's more strong from the security point of view. But this one, it's particularly useful because it can be fast to give you the ID token. When you have a scenario, when you really need the login first and you can get the access token later to access the APIs, this is the best approach that you can do. Just a recap, if you are seeing this for the first time, in this kind of OpenID protocols, the main idea is for you to get tokens, and you have three types of tokens. Sometimes people forget this. You have an ID token, which is related with OpenID, which is about authentication, which contains information about the user, the person that does the login, like email, profile photo, address, personal information. And you usually use this token to make sure that the user is whoever it says he is. So every time you need information about the user, you use ID token. But your application sometimes need to collect information that are on some backends that contains that requires tokens to access. And in this case, you don't want to provide the ID token because the ID token is about the person. You need a token where you delegate to a third application the access or the permission for your application, your client application, to access those APIs. Usually can be a backend that your single application uses, connects directly to the backend, and the backend needs an access token. So you have to generate these access tokens. And usually these tokens, they have a kind of expiry, let's say 30 minutes, 1 day, 6 hours, whatever you decide. And after it expires, of course, you cannot use it. But for that, you have, usually it is provided to you, a refresh token that you can use. So you have these three tokens, one for the user, which is ID token. You have the access token, which is for your client application to have access to resource servers, which are the protected APIs, and the refresh token to assist when the access token loses its validity period. Okay, so but let's go to the hybrid flow after this summary. So what is hybrid flow? The hybrid flow is a type of login flow from the OpenID Connect that mixes the implicit flow, as I said, and the authorization code flow. How? Because it provides you instant login information, meaning that you want to access a site and you need right away information about the user. And then you can delay to get the access token for the next steps. Maybe you want to filter some information and then behind the scenes in a background job, for instance, you start to get the access token. So you can get information about the user and display it. Maybe you have to ask something to the user. Maybe it's create of a dashboard and you want to start to build the dashboard based on the user's preference, for instance, but then you need to feed the data. And for that, you need the access token. And that's why you, in the background, you try to get the access token. Usually, you delegate this task to a backend of your application. So your backend will negotiate with the authorization server the access token and the refresh token. And then after all these steps, you have three tokens that you can use on your web application. That's the main idea of this hybrid flow. So why do you want to use it? First, as I was saying, you want really fast information about the user. Okay, but at the same time, you need to for the access token and the refresh token to be collected from the authorization server in a secure way. So you delegate this to a backend. So in one point, you will have the browser asking for the ID token, but it will be your backend, which is protected and can store, for instance, the client secret to get access token and the refresh token. That's why it's an hybrid approach. It's not the same entity that it's getting the three tokens. The browser gets one and the backend gets the others. You can get all of them at the same time, but it's not a good idea because you will fall on the trap of the security of the implicit flow, the one that I previously said in my previous video. This, by the way, this flow was quite popular before the appearance of the PKCE, which is an extension of the authorization code flow, which is the most popular one and security one. If you want to know more details, you can see my first video about this flow where I explain the authorization code flow in detail, and I include a few slides to explain also the PKCE. Okay. So the actors are the same. Usually they are always the same in all flows. So you have the resource owner, which is the person that will do the login, provide the credentials, the client application, that it's the application that needs to access some API or resource server that is protected and it needs a token. So, but to get the token, of course, it needs someone to approve on the authorization server, say, okay, I am that person and you can provide the token to this client application. You have the authorization server, which is the let's say the watchdog. It will protect everything and say, okay, who are you? What are the scopes? Are you sure you want to do this? So take the ID token, take the access token, and take the refresh token and validates and make sure that everything is smoothly running. And then you have the resource server, which is the server where the resources that are protected and contains the data that you really want, but you need access token to get the data from it. So this is the flow. It's very complicated. I will explain in a moment all the details about these values, but in a very high level, you can pause or later return to here and then try to understand it better. But again, you have the resource owner, you have your client app, you have your backend you will need for this. Remember that this backend, it doesn't belong to here. Your client application is the single page application, but to be fair, it's possible to have two client ID difference on the authorization server and protect both. That's possible, but I'm not explaining here. But if you want to protect the backend also, it's possible to create a client ID for this one and another one for this one. But in those cases, you will need a way to access this one, an access token for this one, and to access a token between this one and this one. Can be complicated to implement, but in environments like banks and things like that, it's popular and the most safest way to implement. But let's return to our example. So I have a single page application. We access the application as a user, and of course you want to get an ID token, and I will explain the details. But you'll say, okay, I want a response type, provide the client ID, the redirect. Remember that the authorization server after the login always redirect some information to a specific address that you should provide. Sometimes these addresses are already configured on the authorization server for security reasons. Other times you can send them directly from the request. Now the scopes, which are the permissions that you give to your client, not to the person, but to the client. Then some state unknowns, which are kind of strings generated to make sure that there are no middlemen, to simplify this discussion. So you go to the authorization server, there will be some login and some consent. You probably already saw, you enter on Google, for instance, and say, okay, this application is trying to read your email. Do you accept it? And you say yes or no. Usually it's the link between what you put on the scope. So the authorization server takes what are you requiring and asks for the real person, do you accept this or not? And if you accept, the token will be generated. In our case, let's say we are generating an ID token. So the authorization server will return to you the ID token. It's possible to add other tokens, and I'll explain in a moment how, but it's the popular way to use this flow, and it was the reason was to generate an ID token, because ID token somehow, I don't say it's more safe than the access token, but let's say it is. Someone knowing who you are and things like that, it's one thing. Accessing protected data on API, it's a completely different thing. Now you receive the ID token, you validate like on the other flows. If you validate the signature, because usually these tokens are signed, and you make sure that it's really well signed, and you extract some information from there, and you check, okay, this is me, this is the correct email. You can even ask to the authorization server to give you more information if you want. Now you take this authorization code that you will receive and you send to your backend. And now the backend will do the rest. We'll get the access token and refresh token. And this part here, it's the same as we saw on our previous flow, the first flow. The first flow works in a specific way, using code to make sure that who started the negotiation of this flow, it's the same one that will end it. So there was no middleman. And these steps are the same that we saw on our first flow, meaning that this one remembers the implicit flow, and the second part between the backend and the authorization server, it's the same as we saw for the authorization flow. And when you reach this 12th step here, you should have the ID token, the refresh token, and the access token. But this code can be done in the background while you are doing other stuff on your web application, like synchronously get information, things like that. It's quite common, asynchronous calls today in single page applications. So let's see step by step. So step one, the user opens web application on their browser. The app needs to authenticate user and gets tokens. That's the first step. Second step, redirect to authorization server. Imagine that it's Google, so you will see a login, and the way for that to happen, it will the get will be something like this. You say that you want a code, and you are interested in the ID token. So there is a space and is on purpose. You can combine, you can put code ID token, code token to access token. I don't advise on that, but it's possible. It is the same that we saw in the implicit flow, and you can even ask for all of them, all three, the code, the token, and ID token. This code, it's the code that we use on the previous flow. It means to control from the first step until the latest step, that there is no middleman, and it will protect that. The implicit flow doesn't have that, so there are a lot of weaknesses. But for instance, you can protect all this flow, but since the first steps will work with the address of the browser, if there is someone with a bookmark or every log about the history, proxies and things like that, will register the logs that were returned. That's the weakness of this protocol. But sometimes it is useful. And if you know the risks or the information, it's not as sensible as we expect. Maybe it's not too as sensible. Maybe we can use it. It's a kind of ponderation. Depends on the discussion, the security architect, and the team, or the requirements of the project. Okay, usually the OpenID and scope is mandatory if you are using OpenID. And you know that you are using OpenID when you require an ID token. Otherwise, usually you don't use, or you don't need OpenID, just OAuth2. So the next steps, the user logs in and he gives the concepts. Usually you should see a list of things that the application is requiring, and a button say, I allow that. Now the step 5 and 6. So the authorization server will redirect back to the address that you provided, or it's configured on the authorization server. And now, but everything it's in the address, and you should extract it from there, which means that it will be on the browser history. That's one of the weaknesses of this flow. And until now, if you saw my previous video about the implicit flow, it's not the same, but it's the same from the semantic point of view. You receive on address the information that you want like this. So it's a parameter on the address. So it means that if this is logged, in proxies in the history of your browser, yeah, everyone has access to this access token, at least if they have access to your machine. But at this time you have this code which belongs to the first flow, the secure one, and this is the code that is used by the authorization flow. That's why it's called hybrid. You have this weakness of the address here to get the tokens, but at the same time you guarantee at least that you start the conversation and you end the conversation using the code the same way as the first flow, the authorization flow, does. You have the code, the state, and you can receive the ID token, access token, things like that. You don't have to receive all of them. It depends, again, on what you provided here. Here you are saying, okay, I'm interested in the code, like the first flow and the ID token, but you can request more than those two. You can even ask for the access token, and this is a way to do. So you say, okay, please, when after you call the authorization server, it will reply to you, okay, take this code, take this state, and take the tokens that you required for me. They can be here or not, depending on your request, and of course the expiration time. I would advise you to not put access token on this call, but you can. Okay, now you extract and validate the tokens on the sixth step. Okay, so the token is validated on the client side. Client side is your browser. You can check the signature, the issuer, the audience, the expiration, and the nodes. I will create some videos to explain in detail all of this. But for instance, the issuer, it's we issue this, it's the authorization server. The audience, usually it's the backends that you can access with this token. The expiration, I think it talks by itself. It's just to kind of a spoiler alert for future videos where I will explain this into detail. So once validated, the app knows who the user is and can start a session. Okay, now it's the backend working. Okay, so you send the code to the backend. You are the browser and you say, okay, I received the code. It's not access token or the ID token, it's the code. And if you understand the first flow, you understand why you need to provide this code. So you send this code to the backend, so the backend can negotiate with the authorization server the access token and the refresh tokens. And this you can do something like this, like in JavaScript. Sometimes I provide here some code, so I do a post, and you provide this code to your backend. Of course, it will be, you should create this backend and create the API, and you should know what to do with this information. But with this code, you can send this code because you know what is the authorization server. So you send this code to the authorization server, and the authorization server that generated this code should know what we want. And probably you want an access token and a refresh token. So the backend exchanges the code for tokens via secure server-to-server request, because it's the backend. Now there in the backend, you can store the client secret. So you can do a direct request to the authorization services. Please give me these access tokens, and it's secure because it's on the backend. It's not on the browser. Okay, so you send the code, the client ID. This is the backend talking with authorization server, the client secret if needed, and the redirect, meaning, okay, then reply and give me the tokens that I want. So this is an example. So you grant type authorization code. It's the same as the first flow. You provide the code, the redirect, the client ID, client secret. And if you see my previous video about this, the first flow, which is the most important one, let's say like this, it's not that more important than the others. I will say more popular one. You will see that these are the parameters that are expected in authorization server. Remember at this time, your browser already contains the ID token, and you can do things with that. But now at the same time, this is happening on the backend, or maybe it's synchronous. But if it's synchronous, yeah, maybe it's not the hybrid. It's not a good approach for your solution. And now the authorization server responds to the backend with access token, refresh token, and if you didn't receive the ID token, maybe you just requested the code on the first step. You didn't request the ID token. So, and you say, okay, my backend will get all the tokens. I want for this to be real secure. But if that's the case, maybe you don't need the hybrid approach. You want to go directly with the authorization flow, the first one. And these tokens are stored securely by the backend. And probably you want to provide them to the application. In this case, usually this architecture, just to give you some overview about this type of architectures. In this case, most of the times you just have a kind of a cookie on the browser. And if you secure all of these tokens on the backend, it means that your backend is somehow public. So you connect your backend, and your backend will do all the connections to the resource service, meaning that the API that you want to access, it's not your backend, but it's other backends. And then the browser connects directly. This is quite common in Angular applications and React applications, things like that. So you have a backend, and with things like create user, get user, but the tokens are on the backend, not on the browser. It depends on your approach, but I will say that the hybrid approach fits better this kind of scenarios. If the first backend is already protected, the hybrid approach, I don't know if it's a good idea. If you have two, you have to get the access token on the browser, which is not a good thing, but sometimes it's there. Then you have step 10 and 12. So use the access token, receive protected data, and update UI. The common stuff after you have the tokens, it depends of your application. So the backend uses access token to request for the resource server, as I was saying. It's not your browser going directly to the backends that contain the sensible information, but it's your backend that is doing that. That's the difference between this flow and the first flow, I would say, in terms of architecture. So this is some code if you want to explore, but usually it's just to show you some technical information about what we are doing. So you have the login, so you target your Auth server. This is conceptual, don't copy paste this code and think it will work, but it could be, if you start to develop, it will be similar to this one if you use JavaScript. So the first thing you should do is the response type. You are here, you are saying, okay, give me a code and an ID token. And this is the client ID that you should take into consideration. No secret here because you are in the browser. You don't want to store the secret in your browser. Otherwise, there will be no security on your architecture. And you are saying to authorization server, reply to this address to give me what I'm asking. In this case, I expect to receive a token and ID token. Okay, the scope, it's OpenID and profiled OpenID. It's required because I'm putting here ID token. It's OpenID. It's a requirement from this protocol. If you require an ID token and are using OpenID, on the scope, it's mandatory for you to write OpenID, and then you generate two different strings here on the state and the nodes that will be useful to avoid middlemans and similar things on the communication with authorization server. Now you handle the redirect, so you receive the information and you extract. Remember, this is a redirect, it goes directly to the address of your browser, and now you extract the code here. Okay, go to the search parameters, you extract ID token, and if you ask for it, it's not the case here, but if you ask for it, you also can get the access token. I don't advise on this, but sometimes you need it. Okay, you should know what you're doing. Remember that you will receive this in address, which should be in logs during all this communication. You have to trust on the platform that is doing this. If it's a back office, maybe it's somehow secure, but if it's a public website, I don't recommend for you to put on addressed access token. It's not that the browser cannot receive the access token. It's not a good idea to receive it on the address. If it receives with a post or you do a get and receive in JSON, it's one thing because you can store it as a cookie or store it as, in the storage. So there will be no log about this. But if you are receiving an address, that's the problem here on the security. Now you create a method to validate the token to make sure it's what you expect. You can take into consideration the signature, the audience, and the attributes that I've talked previously when we saw the internals of the token. Okay, now you send the token to your backend that you received. It's not the ID token, just the token. Okay, so you call your backend. It's not authorization server. You do a post and you pass your code, and now you should receive a response after the backend did all the negotiation with authorization server. Okay, and now it's just you just use it to get some that you can go directly with the research server. Of course, you have to add the header authorization with the access token that you got from your backend. For instance, this can be on your browser if you provide the access token to your browser, or for your backend if your backend, for instance, is using Node.js and you are one of those persons. I think it's a good idea to use JavaScript on the backend part. The code should be similar to this one, and then it's a common pattern. Ask for something, and if the response is okay, you do what you have to do, and if it fails, you do what you have to do when it fails, and then you can just display the data that you want for the user. Of course, the username and email you can extract from the ID token. You don't need a research server for that. The benefits, as I said previously, is the fast user feedback. Remember that the first step is going to authorization server and say, give me information about the user. And you receive the ID token and you can do whatever you want after this. But remember that you are not mandatory to receive the ID token. You can just say, give me the token and then send this token to your backend, and the backend negotiate and receive all these 3 tokens, and you just use your backend. That's another way to do it. It depends on security and when do you need information. Maybe you need the ID token on the browser because you want quite fast information to display to the user. It's one of the responsive user websites and really fast to display it. And then later you need the data. Okay. But at the same time, you have some security better than the implicit because it's your backend that is going to get the sensible tokens that you want to use on your applications. And at the same time, since you are using the nonce parameter, it will avoid the replay attacks that are possible, for instance, with other flows, more weakness flows, let's say like that. So when should we use this hybrid flow? Mainly it's the use case that I already provided. You want instant identity on the front end. You have a single page application dashboard that greets the user and then starts to load data. So for you to greet the user, you need at least after the login to say, hey, welcome, and some information about it. Please confirm this. But behind the scenes, you are connecting to your backend and asking for the access token and the refresh token. Okay, that's one advantage. The same thing here, again, financial applications, it's the same concept. Sometimes you really need the user. And I remember that sometimes I use financial applications and after I do the login, then you see time to load the data. It's like I already know who you are. I accept for you to enter the application. But now to access the real data, I will negotiate with the backend. I will send the code and you'll get the access token that I can use. When we say here, single page application, you can apply this, for instance, for mobile applications. And then, of course, if you are on legacy with, for instance, the implicit flow and you want to migrate to the full PKCE authorization flow, but it's not possible, maybe at least you can improve a little better the security by using the hybrid flow. That's another use case where you can apply this flow. So things to keep in mind when you use the hybrid flow, it's more complex because you have the implicit flow, somehow unsafe, with a very safe authorization flow, and you have to understand everything here. So it's usually complex to implement, which means more testing, more integrations, more challenges to overcome, right? If you can just use PKCE, it's usually a better choice. It is called Authorization Code Flow with PKCE. I presented this on the first video. Go there if you can use it from zero. And when should you use this one? Again, it's if you really need to use it. You have a legacy system and you want to increase better from the implicit flow or other one that exists there that it's not good and you want, but it's not possible for you at this time to use the authorization code flow with PKCE. Okay, in conclusion, the hybrid flow gives you quick user login feedback, and I'm sure that you got this idea. I've repeated a lot during this video. It's an official and valid OpenID Connect flow. It's not that you shouldn't use it. You should understand it and apply in the best use case, but remember that there are other flows that you should know to choose the best one. Okay, so it's good to understand hybrid flow works, but think careful before using it on single page applications, because usually this one, it will be, if you can use this one, but sometimes there are use cases you cannot use it and you want to go with this hybrid approach. So this is the flow that I wanted to present to you today. I hope it was useful for you. I hope it's a third one. Check the previous ones, and if you understand all of them, I'm sure, at least from the security point of view and authentication and authorization, you will understand a lot about architectures and what should be your approach in several types of architectures, single page applications, web servers, device, machine to machine. We'll see all the 6 possible flows using OAuth2 / OpenID. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you like it. Please subscribe my channel. Do a like if you really learned something from it. Share with our friends, and thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in my next video.